Welcome to Series 6. We really hope you enjoyed our chat with John Alchemist last week, and that you all got some great ideas and inspiration from it. This week starts a brand new series discussing Blue Planet with Jeff Barber and Rich Howard.
Are you supporting the One Shot Patreon? You should be. The Patreon supports not just One Shot and Campaign, but other great shows like Neoscum, Warda, and us. If you like what we are doing, which I assume you do because you are listening to this intro, please consider becoming a patron. Just $5 a month will get you access to the Secret Archive, which has some awesome content like past Gen Con panels, extra episodes of Campaign, and we'll soon have some stuff from your favorite show, Character Creation Cast.
Also, we have a Discord server, and if you join it, it will have members. If you want to chat about things you heard on our show, have cool concepts you want to share, or if you just want to chat with other folks who love RPGs as much as you do, come join us at discord.charactercreationcast.com. We'll also put a link to the server in the show notes for your convenience.
We would really love to see you guys in there and to chat about super cool concepts that you guys have.
Yeah, or life or other things.
Yes, I mean, we can also talk about other things, but mostly characters.
Exactly.
And now it's time for your favorite part of the show, where we read a review. This one is titled My Favorite RPG Podcast by Ghost4812 from the USA. None of the RPG podcasts that I listen to get me as hyped to actually play tabletops as Creation Cast. You bring joy to me and many others. You should be proud of what you've accomplished with this show.
Oh, thank you, Ghost.
Thank you so much. That was super sweet. And we are proud of it. And we're proud of you, too, for writing us this review.
Yes. And if you want to make us proud, like Ghost has made us proud, please go ahead and write a review for us. The easiest place to do that would be Apple Podcasts, right through the iTunes app. And we'll be able to get that and get it into one of our show openers.
Hey, Ryan, can I tell you a fun fact?
Yes.
People can also leave us reviews on our Facebook page.
Oh, that's true.
We already have one review there, but it's from somebody who also left us one on iTunes. So sorry, Kyle, it doesn't count if you do it twice.
But we love you anyway.
We do. We appreciate your review, but we're not going to read it again. Unless we run out, and then we will.
Yeah.
So write us some more reviews so we don't have to read Kyle's review again.
Exactly.
All right, with all of that out of the way, let's get to the show.
Yeah, enjoy. Welcome to Character Creation Cast, a show where we discuss and create characters, the best part of role-playing games, with guests using their favorite systems. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan, and this episode, my co-host Amelia and I welcome two very special guests. First up, we have Rich Howard, host of the Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast, devoted to analyzing the Young Justice television series. He is also one of the creators of Descent into Midnight, a Powered by the Apocalypse RPG, and creator of an Alchemist Class for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Welcome, Rich.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
We are too. Joining Rich today is Jeff Barber, original creator for the game that we are going to be covering today, actually. Blue Planet version 2, published by Biohazard Games, a futuristic role-playing game that takes place on an alien water world.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
We are so excited to have you both here with us. I can't wait to talk about this game.
Yeah.
Me too.
So, Rich, we'll start with you. Do you want to tell everybody a little bit more about yourself and any other stuff that you've got going on?
Sure. Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I'm one of the co-hosts and co-creators of Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast, where we analyze Young Justice, the DC Comics animated TV series. But we do more than just analyze the show kind of within itself. We broaden our net so to speak, and talk about storytelling and creation in general. And seeing as it was co-created by myself and the Caleb G from the RPG Academy, role-playing games do come up from time to time. In fact, we had a Masks one-shot where we invited Brendan Conway, who created Masks, onto the show to run a game for us between seasons 1 and season 2. That was brilliant. So yeah, if you're interested in that, the Venn diagram crossover of gaming and Young Justice or DC Comics, pop over there for that. Descent into Midnight, as you mentioned, is a Powered by the Apocalypse role-playing game where you are playing sentient aquatic creatures on an alien world, protecting their community from a physical and existential threat. I'm developing that with Taylor Labrecht from the Leviathan Files, Richard Kreutz Landry from Origami Gaming, and Brandon Leon Gambetta, who you've had on the show, is also on our team. And I am super excited to have him on because if you listen to him on your guys' episode, you can tell how both excited and skilled the man is. So there are those two major projects. And then before I got into doing what I do now, I have a degree in marine biology from back in the day, which is kind of how I got fed into this and discovered Blue Planet 20 years ago last year, Jeff, right?
Yeah, 20 years.
20 years ago.
We're going old school today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I was like, I want more of aquatic gaming. Nobody does need all these aquatic monsters in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual in D&D, and nobody ever writes these aquatic adventures. And then I got my wish came true with Blue Planet. So,
Awesome.
And then, Rich, what do you do in your free time then?
Well, I'm a nurse. My free time, I'm a nurse. I'm a dad. I do all that kind of stuff. So I'm also I guest on podcasts, which is
also
always an honor.
You may know Rich from other podcasts.
From lots of other. Actually, if you get interested in some of the stuff we're talking about today, I was just on. As of this recording, I was just on a podcast called Get Hype, which is a brilliant podcast with Ali and Mel, who just invite people on who are excited about whatever and invite them on to talk about the thing they're excited about. And well, I'm excited about marine biology stuff.
Yeah, so, I think Rich's secret goal is to be on all podcasts.
Pretty much.
Yeah. I would not turn that invitation down.
And fair warning, you may not want to listen to those episodes in the dark in a bathtub, because we've heard some pretty bad experiences about that.
Okay, so the deep ocean can get a little scary. It wasn't my intention to Allie got up and left the room one time. It was not my intention to scare her that bad. But it was a good episode. We had a lot of fun. It is nature's fault. I mean, you bring up the barrel eye and bobbit worms and people get scared. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here, Rich.
You bet.
And Jeff, how about yourself?
I'm here mostly because Rich inspired me to get back into the gaming industry and introduced me to this whole idea of promotion through podcasting. So that's been a boon. I was part of the team that wrote Blue Planet, as Rich pointed out, 20 years ago. I do want to make sure I shout out to my partner, Greg Benage, especially because he's the one who's primarily responsible for this. The V2 mechanics that we'll be making characters in today. Nice. He was essential to Blue Planet. It would never have seen the light of day had he not gotten involved. And for anyone who's familiar with Fantasy Flight Games output during the 2000s, anything to do with role-playing was done under his sort of auspices. He was their role-playing director, among other things, for a long time. So I just want to make sure to credit him where it's due, because Blue Planet is the game it is because of his contributions.
Nice.
But I was out of it for a long time. I mean, we did Blue Planet. I did another game for actually kind of a work for hire job for Fantasy Flight called Midnight, which was put out during the big sort of era of D20 games. And it's essentially what if Sauron won, and it's 100 years later. And that had a pretty good run, but that's, like I said, done under the auspices of Fantasy Flight. But then I kind of got out of the game writing for a long time and just played games. But then a few years ago, I couldn't shake an idea I had for a new game on the narrative end of the spectrum, and sort of got more and more serious about it until some people encouraged me to actually publish it. and then we did the whole Kickstarter thing. So last year we kickstarted Upwind, which is essentially a love letter to Studio Ghibli adventure films like Castle in the Sky or Valley of the Wind. The pitch I usually give people is that as if Disney's Treasure Planet, had a head-on collision with Ralph Bakshi's Wizards, and then we put out the resulting flames with a whole lot of Castle in the Sky by Studio Ghibli. It's extremely narrative, so it's the polar opposite of the simulationist nature of Blue Planet. It's a stakes-based game that's driven by hands of playing cards.
Nice.
And character creation is also very different, as the characters are based on descriptive phrases instead of actual spelled out stats. So it's very different. We're in the process of releasing that, and it should be hitting the shelves in the next couple of months, hopefully. So I'll be glad to get that to backers.
Very cool.
In my day job, I am a teacher, and one of the things I teach is marine science. So, and I took it to heart when some English teacher I had in high school said, "Write what you know," and that's essentially the reason Blue Planet is about a water world, is because that's kind of what I knew.
Yeah. It's marine biology oceanography porn, basically. Yeah. I mean, I read some stuff where people were trying to write things, and I was like, I guess it's okay. I guess it's what I'm going to get. And then I picked up Blue Planet, and I was like, what is this magic? And then I just kept reading it, and then some of the supplements are ridiculous. We'll talk about that later.
Rich, the check's in the mail. You can tone it down a little bit.
I don't need a check. I already own 4 copies of Ancient
I know
Echoes.
you've already probably contributed more to Blue Planet's bottom line than any single customer we've ever had. So.
It's so good. Yeah, Jeff and I met. We talked a little bit online a little bit, but we didn't meet for the first time until. Was it
we've
2 years?
We've known of each other for probably a decade at least.
At least, yeah. Through the old, there's a Yahoo group, and I emailed you at one point in time about possible novelizations and some stuff.
Oh,
like
all right,
that.
I remember that.
Yeah, but then was it 2 years ago? Yeah, it was 2 years ago with Upwind when you said you had a new thing, and I was like, "Oh, you got a new thing? Come to Gen Con. I'm introducing you to everyone."
Which you did.
And check that box off. And then you had the Kickstarter, which was great. And then last year, I actually got to 20th anniversary of Blue Planet. At the 50th anniversary of Gen Con, you ran a Blue Planet game for me, and I had a big old fat, bucket list check off with that game. It was amazing.
Yeah, I think a lot of people got
jealous
that checked off.
of that game. Like everybody was tweeting about it after it happened, because this was the 50th Gen Con was my first Gen Con. And everybody was tweeting about it, and I was like, this is amazing. I want to be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, fortunately and unfortunately, some of the tweets were like Nitai Dasa tweeting at 2:00 in the morning, like 8 hours after the game, going, "I have so many questions, and the answers will bring me no solace." So, that was the kind of game it was. It was emotionally wrecking, and I was going to say one of the best, but it was absolutely the best game I've run or played in 40 years. It was
the best table I've ever run for. So
it was breathtaking.
That made all the difference.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
The players were awesome.
I love hearing about experiences like that with games, that where you have those moments where you're like, this is, I had a game like that at a Catacon where I had a moment of like, oh, this is everything that I have wanted a game to be for years.
Right.
And it feels so good.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, yeah. Jeff was shaking afterwards, and he was running the game. So, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, enough of that. I'll talk about that all day. But,
we're really excited that you guys are both here. This is going to be so much fun. So should we go ahead and now we can start talking about the game? Jump right in and find out exactly what this game is all about.
What's in a game?
So let's start with the setting of Blue Planet. Reading through the book, there is a lot of rich backstory that encompasses the world. But could you give us a brief explanation of where and when this game takes place?
Well, it takes place on Earth's first extrasolar colony planet. It's been dubbed Poseidon, and it turns out that it's a water world with about 97% ocean coverage. on the other side of what people first think is a naturally occurring wormhole, and something like, I forget the actual distance, something like 15 light years from Earth. But then through
35.
35. Oh, there you go.
Because I read it this morning.
But as the game as the Metaplot, which was also common in the 90s of the game sort of develops, it becomes more and more apparent that it might not be a natural wormhole.
Oh,
The plot thickens.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And so the colony itself was originally just a scientific expedition until something was discovered in the crust of the planet called xenosilicate, or later in the slang, long john. It was a mineral that could be used as a template for refining genetic engineering. And that led to a gold rush where it was now sort of an economic viability to colonize a planet, because this stuff was so valuable in that it allowed for complete genetic engineering, including longevity treatments, and essentially making people immortal.
Oh, wow.
And so there was a very much the intention to create a futuristic gold rush as the sort of primary driving force for this mad dash colonization of the planet, and it in part trying to keep the economics of a trans-solar colony viable, at least within the fiction.
Mm. And one of the things that I found the most fascinating was where things get a little complicated, which is where genetically modified settlers are sent to Poseidon, and then they're supposed to get resupply runs from Earth, but then they don't arrive. And the reason they don't arrive is because of an ecologic disaster that hits Earth.
Oh.
And so the Earth recovers from this ecologic disaster, but it takes about 100 years.
Yeah, about 75 years, yeah.
Yeah. So it takes about 75 years to recover, and then another maybe 25 years to just get, I don't know, running again. Anyway, so it takes a long time. And so they're like, oh, well, those colonists we sent must be dead because we didn't send any resupply run, but let's go check out this planet again. So they send colonists to the planet, and they find out that the original colonists were still alive, and they, and there's a whole generation or multiple generations that were born on the planet, and that's their home. And so you have these high-tech colonial settlers coming in for this gold rush and wanting to monetize a whole lot of aspects of the planet. But you have these human settlers. Some have been genetically modified. Most have been genetically modified to be able to live on the planet well. For example, with what they call aquaforms. So either humans that have been genetically adapted to be able to hold their breath for an hour and increased myoglobin in their muscles and so on and so forth, or what are called squids, which are humans that have been modified to be able to draw oxygen with gills directly out of the water itself. And so you have this kind of native, quote unquote, primitive culture and this incoming high tech culture, which is one of 25 different plot elements that you could pull on to be creating games for the setting. In addition to all, so there's a lot of politics and there's a lot of other things, civil war even,
which I get really excited about, because as excited as you are about the marine biology part of it, I was like, ooh, right. Colonization, and as a political scientist, that's my jam.
Right.
So
that's one of the
really excited about that kind of stuff.
About the setting, it makes it's my favorite science fiction setting, I have to say, because it is not just where there are definitely some wonderful advantages to being able to, with our modern kind of mentality about role-playing games, to tell a specific story with a specific role-playing game, that a role-playing game is supposed to evoke a specific experience. Mm-hmm. There is something to be said about a rich, broad, deep setting that you can tell a lot of stories in, and not many science fiction settings are like that. If you're running a Star Trek game or you're running a Star Wars game, you can have some flexibility within that setting, but there's a particular feel to Star Trek or a particular feel to Star Wars. And what Blue Planet offers from, my perspective, being someone who didn't write the game, but someone who loves and reads the game, is that you can tell a wide range of stories from street level, crime to, politics, to rescue, to survival, to exploration, to discovering what this thing is about this wormhole that is apparently potentially not actually a naturally occurring stable wormhole, and what that may or may not lead to. And I don't want to spoil anything.
No, it seems like there's a lot of threads that you can pull on pretty easily, just from the very basic knowledge of the Metaplot, which is kind of nice, because I think a lot of those 90s games having Metaplot sometimes is a high barrier to entry for people, just because it feels like there's a lot to know, but this one at least feels like you could have a pretty base knowledge and still operate pretty easily.
That's actually been the most common criticism of the game, is that there's too much, that the learning curve is steep, and people feel intimidated by trying to learn what's going on, but then also figure out what kind of campaign to run, because there's no default campaign. A lot of games have an expectation that these are what the heroes are and these are what the heroes do. These are what the PCs do. But Blue Planet didn't have that. The intention was to create a living, breathing world sort of across the ecological and socioeconomic political spectrums. And then you could just live in that world and play however you wanted to. But I think that still proves to be a little much for some gaming tables, and requires sort of a level of dedication that something a little more directed, with a little more open background, doesn't necessarily require.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's one thing that I'm learning so far doing this podcast too, is that it takes all kinds. And, the things that one person really, really loves about a game, another person looks at it and goes, why would I want that? Uh-huh. So I think some things having a really structured Metaplot and a really kind of tight world to play in, some people really, really like that. And other people really enjoy having something totally open. I kind of like something in the middle where you have different things that you can kind of explore, but having at least some structure to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there are some advantages too, because the game that we were referring to at Gen Con, we were a rescue team, which is a really good, solid way to introduce characters to the setting, in my opinion. Yeah. Because it allows the excuse for exploration. It allows the excuse for being hired by political organizations or whatever it happens to be. Or if there's a disaster, you can get people lost and have to do survival stuff. There's lots of things you can do. But in that particular game, we thought we were in a political intrigue game. We thought that we were sent there were some missing people. And so we went to go try to help because we were a rescue team. So we thought that we were in a political game where one political group was trying to sabotage a different political group. About 2 hours in, we started to realize that we may actually be in an existential horror instead. And like any good horror game, which is not, I think, what Jeff was necessarily intending, but we kept no, that can't be happening. No, there's some other reason that's happening. There's got to be a logical explanation for this. There kind of was, but it was based on nothing we had knowledge of. And so when the reality of what was happening started to make itself apparent, it scared the crap out of us in the best possible way. It was amazing. And if you're having a game a game like Masks, right? Or a game like something even more specific, say Night Witches, where you're playing Russian female fighter pilots in World War II. You're looking for a very specific kind of game experience. And I think that's great for people who don't have a lot of time in the modern day to sit down and say, what do I want to play? What do I want to experience? And sit down and do that. But a world that's so rich and deep as Poseidon is, and varied, you can have one game to the next game can stay fresh because you can have a whole different kind of game every time you play, or realize that you're in an existential horror.
That's the best kind of horror, though, where it sort of slowly creeps up and you don't know what's happening.
At one point, I made this horrifying realization based on something Jeff had said. I turned to Darcy Ross. I pointed out what he had actually said, and Darcy freaked out.
Oh.
I was like, oh my God, is that what he just said? What did he just say? That's it. What? Oh my God. Yeah, it was great. But you also have to have a table that's signed up for that's willing to dive into that. I mean, if somebody wants to do plot politics and ends up in a horror game, sometimes that can be that cannot be the best. Right. But in this case, it worked out great. So yeah, there's upsides and downsides.
So we've talked about this a little bit, and it sounds like it kind of depends on what sort of game you play. But in a game of Blue Planet, what are your characters doing? Like, what is in D&D, you go adventuring, in L5R, you are samurai. Like, what do you do in this game?
That depends on the table's interests, right? And I think, like I mentioned before, it is a bit of a barrier to entry for some GMs because there's not an obvious sort of plot trail to follow. You have to have a story that you want to tell and you can tell any kind of story you want. You can have everything from local family troubles to globe spanning sort of cryptic mysteries about the Metaplot, and then everything in between. There are many factions that are provided exactly for that reason. So you can play corporate intrigue, or you can play native insurgents, or you can play GEO law enforcement, or scientists, or street thugs. There's even a bunch of I love games that involve like sort of nefarious people, but people that are doing the right thing. So there's all kind of stuff in there about various crime families and syndicates and that sort of thing. So you can use those tropes and pressures. So really, I think more than most games, you have to come into it with a story that you want to tell, and then that will structure what the characters do. The longest running campaign I ran we called it Red Sky Charters. And this, I probably should point out, Blue Planet has a very kind of Western feel to it, Wild West kind of feel to it intentionally. Okay. I mean, we've got marshals and we've got bounty hunters and we've got even a place called Kansas where they raise cattle and there's horses, right? Like it's intended to have a very Wild West feel to it because we're trying to evoke some of the tropes of the frontier. Mm-hmm. And it actually predates Firefly. So I always have to point that out because people feel like we plan and they're like, oh, it's just like Firefly. This campaign I was running, Red Sky Charters, was essentially Firefly, but instead of a ship, they had a location, just a sort of a beachfront location and a boat. And they were a family, an extended family of sorts. And they just kept having the same sorts of adventures that happened in Firefly, right? Wide ranging based on them trying to do jobs, but ultimately the jobs never being the focus of the thing. And then the random events around them being the focuses of the story. And what that allowed me to do was playtest all kinds of different ideas I was having for the setting. And so not only it could have different kinds of characters, but they could go from political intrigue to simple survival story to sort of an alien mystery within a series, just as many weeks, right?
Yeah.
And so games can be designed in Blue Planet to play off of those options as well.
Very cool. So outside of the rule book, before we get into anything else, if people are interested in playing this game, what sort of materials are they going to need? Like what sort of dice are needed? And is there anything else that's special that they might need to play this game?
Nothing special. The version 2 books, there's 2 of them. There's the player's guide, which you need for character generation and mechanics, and then the moderator's guide, which has most of the basic setting. So it'd be tough to play just with the player's guide. I'd recommend the moderator's guide too, for the GM at least. Kind of beyond that, each player just needs character sheet and 3D10.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then I will point out that the moderator's guide, as I will point out for most of the supplements as well for Blue Planet, personally, I think there's some of the best written supplements I've ever read. And some of this is how they're laid out. And the moderator's guide, for example, there's this whole world developed an ecology separate from Earth. So there's not really monsters, quote unquote. It's just all natural animals. But the way things developed were very, very different. And so the moderator's guide has a nice selection of creatures that you can run into. But one of the things that was very subtle that Jeff and his team did was they took a very simple thing that evolved on our planet and changed it on Poseidon to make everything really alien. So, and that thing is the development of complex eyes.
Oh.
So we have these compound eyes structures that are very similar to like an octopus, for example. And a lot of mammals do. We relate to each other through our eyes. On Poseidon, compound eyes didn't evolve. All the animals on that planet have eye spots. So even if you see something that looks like an analog of something on Earth, like it looks kind of like a monkey maybe, when it turns around, it has no eyes.
Yeah.
It's an eyeless monkey with eye spots on its face. And that simple change in a perfectly reasonable evolutionary reasoning makes everything feel horrifyingly alien. Even if it's a very friendly animal, it just doesn't feel, it's familiar, yet different in a way that tweaks you. And the moderator's guide talks about things like that, survival and different ecologies, and gives you quite a wide range of examples of surface creatures and aquatic creatures to make it really feel different. So the player's guide and the moderator's guide will give you plenty of stuff to work with, but all the other supplements brilliantly laid out and written.
That's a really cool, like, scientific sort of change too, though, because it makes sense that things would evolve differently. Just, I mean, all of genetics is just like small, tiny mistakes, you know, somewhere in the genetic code. And so that's like a fascinating little piece to just change like one little thing and have, you know, everything from there sort of spiderweb out.
Right.
Yeah.
And all of the world is like that. So if you think that's interesting, that's just like one thing.
Just like, have I got the game for you?
I got the game for you. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's just, that stuff fascinates me as somebody who does, you know, I work in cancer research in my day job too. And that's, you know, what so much of that is like one tiny little genetic change that messes everything up. And so.
Well, another thing, like from the planetary oceanography kind of aspect to it, the fact that it's 97% water means that there's no large land masses. And when there's no large land masses like continents on our planet, and you get a tropical storm, the tropical storms hit our coast and break up. But if there's no giant land masses to help break those things up, they develop into superstorms until they blow themselves out. So imagine living on these islands and archipelagos and having these giant superstorms that are like nothing we've seen on our planet come blowing through. How do you survive that? How do you live through that? Like that in and of itself could be a horrifying series of adventures, just trying to deal with the consequences of something like that. And again, it's just based on a perfectly reasonable change, like on a planet.
Oh, that's so cool.
Right? See?
Oh, it's so cool. Okay, so I feel like almost like we there's no way we have time for our next question really, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Which is what would you say is unique about this game? What is the thing that makes Blue Planet a different game rather than like a different setting for another game? Does that make sense?
Well, I actually made some notes about this question. I think you're right. It would be hard if we started talking about individual items from the book specifics. So maybe it's easier to talk about the themes. I mean, the intention was when we designed it, we didn't think it was going to do, this is way back before Kickstarter and all that kind of thing. So everything you had to kind of bootstrap and do without social media and through distributors and that kind of thing. We were afraid that if we were able to put out the first book, that would be it. So we wanted it to be as complete as possible and as full as possible because we figured that was our only shot. And we went for as much realism as possible. There were a lot of things that ended up changing throughout production just to make it more, realistic with air quotes, because we're talking about science fiction, but we wanted everything to be at least as plausible based on 1997 technology and science. Yeah, right. Because some things have changed. Who saw cell phones coming like they did? But yeah, so we wanted it to be as real as possible. It was the 90s and games had moved from what characters could do to sort of what the environment was like, what was the world around the characters doing. And so we wanted it to be simulationist in a way. We wanted it to feel like a real world, or at least a plausible world. The thing I like best about role playing is feeling like I am in the world that's being played. And I wanted that to be sort of a central tenet of of the game. And I think it succeeds because of that realism, at least in that goal. Simulationist sort of environments are not for everybody. And you can tell because there just aren't that many games like it, not many games that do the simulationist thing.
Right.
Certainly anymore. But that create worlds that are sort of intentionally that detailed and specific. Wanted the ecology to be part of that realism. And so there are not only scientific ecological themes embedded in the book, but there's a lot of sort of environmentalism embedded in the book, which was simply something close to my heart and important thematically still, but certainly through the 90s when we were writing this. And so that's not only part of the sort of meta impression that the book leaves, and in fact, it's been a source of criticism for the book from people who aren't necessarily into that kind of thing, but it's also the ultimate message of the book, if there could be said to be a message in a role-playing game, right? Because we got the natives that are trying to protect their home against this economic invasion that's happening, and the disregard that is being shown to the planet, which is being sort of a repeat of what was happening on Earth and led to the troubles they had on Earth in the first place. And then, of course, we tried really hard to make it hard science fiction. There aren't a lot of role-playing games that can really kind of be called hard sci-fi. And so we tried to make everything, even the existence of the wormhole, as plausible as theories of the 90s would allow.
Mm-hmm.
And still make it gameable, right? I mean, we didn't want it to be like, physics and problem solving, but we wanted it to read like there was a reasonable thread of technology through the whole thing, and that all of the ecological and sort of scientific principles were based on real facts.
Nice.
So how did you go about making sure that, I mean, obviously that's an area of interest for you, but how do you go about making sure that it is as scientifically accurate or plausible as possible? Were you guys interested in the scientific side of it to begin with? Or, I mean, because I think for a lot of game developers, it's a love of the storytelling and that kind of stuff. And we bring what we know to it, but this has like an extra added level of...
Well, I'm a marine science teacher in my day job. So I was already halfway there, and it's an occupational hazard, I guess, but you want to be, I'm not going to teach the subject and then write it in a sloppy way. So that was sort of went hand in hand, and it was part of the intent to be sort of a realistic / simulationist environment. When we did have questions beyond our scope, my partner, very intelligent guy, but trained as an economist. So I think some of that comes through, but neither one of us were sort of, had any real knowledge of astronomy or of the physics associated with space travel and that kind of thing. And so we would reach out to some people and consult with them, or actually got a couple of people to do some freelance work when it came to that kind of thing. Even the picking of the planet that we put Poseidon on, Lambda Serpentis 2, was based on what we knew about exoplanets in the 90s and some actual real stars that might be able to have a Earth-like planet. But we went to a physicist for that information. We went to a physicist for all the orbital information, make sure that our moons and our planetary orbits were reasonable, at least within the realm of possibility.
Nice.
Of course, we know a lot more about exoplanets now. And I don't know, Rich, if you've seen all that stuff that's come out recently about all the water worlds they're discovering.
Oh yeah.
Pretty cool stuff. It's nice to see. It's nice to see some of the things that we've kind of guessed at becoming scientific fact, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an interesting level of sort of research and stuff that has to go into it that I think that we don't have to necessarily do with a lot of other kinds of games, especially the ones that are set in more fantasy settings. And there aren't as many like we have lots of sci-fi games, but there aren't very many that are like a hard sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an added level of work and authenticity that you have to really put in a lot of effort to get to.
And I think that speaking about stuff like that, I think that there is a general impression, the idea that a hard sci-fi setting reduces imagination, like it reduces options in some way. When you're reading like those two things I already just shared about the compound eyes and the superstorms, right? One of the things that blew me away, because my emphasis of study was on marine mammal cognition and sleep physiology, bioacoustics. And so when I read about like, well, how are they handling? Because in Blue Planet, we haven't discussed this yet, but there are uplifted cetaceans. So a cetacean is a dolphin or a whale, right? Mm-hmm. So in this game, as part of this genetic manipulation that they've been doing, they uplifted, which is a term that was introduced by David Brin in a series called The Uplift War. This idea of taking an animal that has a very high level of intelligence, but quote unquote, bringing them up to our level of intelligence. That's showed up in a few settings, but it is handled really weirdly, except in Blue Planet, where they've taken this idea of this uplifting concept. And then he wrote Ancient Echoes, which is this entire supplement focusing on cetaceans and what it is like to be in their head. And this idea of the uplift process basically took the line or barrier between your conscious mind, the dolphin's conscious mind and their subconscious mind, and removed it. So they live both consciously and subconsciously at the same time. Everything is one. So their intuition is incredibly high, right? To the point where people think, oh, they must be psychic or whatever. There's no psychic things in Blue Planet. But the way that they wrote this section, they have a whole section that said, it basically, and I use this phrase all the time, if you're going to play a seat, you're going to play a cetacean character, do not play a human in a dolphin suit, mm-hmm. right? If you're going to, and I take this to other games, if you're going to play an elf, don't play a human in an elf suit, right? Like you can have touches that you want to humanize them so that you can relate to them, but try to be inside that headspace to present that character. And that whole section in Ancient Echoes talking about how to do that with a completely non-human species is brilliant. And so taking that hard sci-fi aspect and looking at, if we uplifted, what would that look like from a scientific, quote unquote, hard sci-fi standpoint, actually opened a door to huge amount of interesting, imaginative things instead of shutting down the door to it. So using science as inspiration for these games instead of making it limiting and thinking like, oh, well, with magic, I can do whatever I want. So that means, I got more choices. Well, kind of, but.
That's a fascinating thing about science in general for me, though. I mean, I have never been good at hard sciences or math, or like I have a liberal arts degree and there's a reason for that. But the thing that has always fascinated me about it is that as it moves forward constantly, it takes all of these things that we thought were essentially magic and now we understand them. And so I feel like the idea that it can't be as whimsical or fantastical or mm-hmm. creative is just absurd.
Right.
Because every day we are moving closer and closer to these things that we thought were just absolutely bananas and could never happen. And now we understand them. Mm-hmm. All these things that we thought were magic or, crazy miracles are really just, weird genetic mistakes or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's, that's a crazy idea that you would think that
and that's the thing, like it's the idea of like necessity is the mother of invention, right? If someone says, here, write a novel for me, you can write it about anything you want. You have no framework. Or if you say like, look, I need a novel about a mutated crazy walrus that, ends up on another planet who's really the pilot of a spaceship. Oh, okay. Well, that sounds nuts, but at least I know I have a bunch of ideas already. So those limitations actually help to guideline and inspire imagination. And I think hard sci-fi can do that. And same thing for superhero stories and all that kind of stuff. When you ground a lot of it in believable reality, then the crazy thing seems almost more plausible than mm-hmm. it was before.
And I think we talked about that a little bit in one of our other episodes that I think probably was it in our L5R episode maybe, but we talked about how having structure sometimes helps with creativity because it gives you so many little pieces to work off of. Mm-hmm. And in this case, that structure is science. But in some cases, it's, this fantasy world or whatever.
It's the trope of writing novels is the difference between reality and fantasy is that fantasy has to make sense.
Yes.
We do have an actual section on oceanography in the game, basic physical oceanography, so that game masters know how light works in water and sound works in water and those kinds of things, which I guess is kind of funny because you don't see those sorts of sections in most role-playing games. No, which I guess is another indication.
It's literally called oceanography for gamers.
So it's just another kind of thing that makes the game a little different, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Where you have like one paragraph. I love D&D 5e, but there's one paragraph about like, if you're underwater, take this one thing into consideration.
Yeah.
It's like 3 sentences. And people are like, I don't know how to run it. And I'm like, well, no wonder.
Yeah.
Right. We talked about that when we were recording last night. We were recording for Edge of the Empire too, and talking about rules in games and things like that. And I said, I think it's always easier to have them and have that information in front of you and say, you know what, in this case, I'm not going to use that. It doesn't apply. It's way better to take that option than to have to pull it from somewhere else and make it fit where it, it isn't really meant to go. It's nice to always have that option, to have it there and have that information in front of you and say, you know what, the sound thing doesn't really apply in this situation, or I don't want to use that mechanic, or I don't, but it's good to have it there in case you do. Mm-hmm. Don't make me do the work. I don't want to do the work. You do the work for me.
Know the rules to break the rules.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Well, now normally we would have looked up the Wikipedia entry for the game that we're about to cover, but we've got
professionals.
We've got the creator of the system here with us, so we might as well throw this your way, Jeff. Could you give us a quick rundown of the history of Blue Planet in terms of developing it, the different versions that have come out?
Sure. So what we call V1, first edition Blue Planet, was the original book. It was a single tome, and it was a percentile-based system, very straightforward, nothing inspired, very early 90s. It got the job done because my interest was looking at the world and what the characters could do, not really creating characters that then allowed you to explore what they were inside. We published that through Biohazard and along with a couple of supplements, and then teamed up with Fantasy Flight, who at the time had hit it big with Disc Wars, but didn't have any role-playing games. And we'd gotten some positive acclaim, so they wanted to sort of acquire a role-playing title. I was getting a little tired of the grind, and so they proposed a second edition. The mechanics that I had written were never great. And my partner, sort of to make the second edition a reason for people to buy the second edition, he redid the mechanics, and that's the V2 mechanics. I think they are far superior to the original mechanics. They work completely differently, and I think they do a much better job of sort of meshing with the intent behind the sort of simulationist and realism of the game. And then Fantasy Flight held on to it for quite a while, produced a bunch of supplements. I think there's 8 or 10 of them. And then the license passed back to us when they decided to let it go. There was another company that picked it up, and that company went through several iterations. It started out as Red Brick, and then it became FESA, and then it became Capricious Games, and they worked on some supplements of their own, and they created kind of a V2 revised, but then quickly realized that they would rather support the previous V2 and sort of let that sort of fade away. And that's where it sits. The license is not with them anymore. The license is reverted to us. V2 is sort of the state-of-the-art, 20-year-old state-of-the-art Blue Planet. And there's talk off and on about doing a new version of the game, one with all kinds of fancy art and some new sensibilities in terms of mechanics and some updates of the technology because, cell phones.
Rich is nodding excitedly because this is an audio medium. People
can't prove anything. This is a podcast.
We've got video backup.
Oh, shoot.
But, that's still a possibility, but right now I'm got to get Upwind out the door before I can really seriously think about it.
Personally, Jeff, I think we're going to skip straight past cell phones, and by the time Blue Planet, the time frame comes around, we'll all have implanted body comps.
Probably,
and we'll be fine. Yeah, we'll just
Combots
come
of
right
some
around
kind.
again. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we sit.
Very
If
cool.
you did work on a version 3, would it be like new mechanics, or is it mostly to update the scientific portions of it? Is that the?
I think there.
I'm going to hold you to this very officially.
Well, I think it would probably be a poor business decision not to revise the mechanics in some way. I really love the system that Greg came up with, but it does. I think before we started recording, I was talking about how, in my mind, there's sort of 3 broad categories of game mechanics. There's the early days, right, and the 80s when it was all about what your character could do, what weapon proficiencies you had, what your armor class was. I think. Then in the 90s, it seemed like, well, what's the world offering the characters, right? What can my character do in the world? And now it seems, and I think Rich has already mentioned this earlier in our conversation, it's more about what can I do inside myself? What can I feel? What can I be? What can I aspire to as a character? And the settings are often sort of secondary. For example, look at how the explosion in Powered by Apocalypse games. It's all about what the character is inside and the changes that occur in those characters, and the settings almost by design are very ephemeral and loose and open to any kind of interpretation. So I imagine we would have to at least nod in that direction for Blue Planet and offer some options that would make the characters more like real people and give a modern players the chance to experience who they can be, a lot like maybe the Seat book sort of does, but for some of the more standard characters.
Yeah. As much as I obviously love and have been inspired by Blue Planet for a long time, Descent into Midnight is mechanically almost entirely opposite of Blue Planet, yet it's going for the same goals. So people are we don't have defined species and we don't have defined races and there's no defined culture. All that's determined at the table by the players. But in that case, what that allows people to do is think about, that one thing I heard about that's really weird about some creature I saw in a documentary this one time. I'm going to make this culture based on it. And then everybody else at the table is like, I've never heard of that before. And then everybody's on the net looking up whatever this crazy thing was somebody brought up. So we're inadvertently having people teach each other marine biology
at the
table. But the thing is, it's again, though, mechanically it's different. The goals that Jeff, where Jeff is doing that through hard science, we went the opposite direction. Like it's full on psionics and bioengineering and craziness and no human influence at all. Where Blue Planet it's all humans all the time, pretty much. Right. And it's all science that was grounded. Yet you can do the same kinds of things. Yet our game is hugely inspired by his. So, and needless to say, I think Jeff and I will be having a conversation about if a third, volume or third edition of Blue Planet comes out, he and I will be discussing kind of how to modernize these mechanics. And because the richness of the mechanics are great for what it is and what he was trying to do, like he was saying. But really, for me, the mechanics are cool and they do some really interesting things in my mind, particularly character generation. But it's the setting that blows my mind.
Oh, yeah.
And so to have that still be present and then modernize that for a modern, narrative, more narratively focused, a little less simulationist focused audience would really be what I would like to see. So.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think he's right in that games really have changed a lot, and I think that we've seen that in the span of the few games that we've covered so far, just how different the feel is, particularly mechanically. I think settings are still, there's some games with some really great settings that still just blow me away, but mechanically we've moved away from a lot of that crunch that games in the 90s had. It's much more narrative, much more open.
If I wanted to make any kind of comparison between Blue Planet and something like a modern audience would appreciate, I would say Mass Effect. right? So a video game that has has a hugely rich, deep history that's its own thing, that's not influenced by the Star Trek, Star Wars kind of, inertia, yet is entirely based on narrative choices and emotions and morals and, that kind of thing. That's kind of what I would like to see in a third edition of Blue Planet, which I haven't mentioned to Jeff yet, and he's currently out of the room. So I'm going to have to talk to him about that. That's what I would like to see.
That would be really cool.
Yeah. And you can have that sort of narrative focused game and still have this really elaborate and rich setting. That's kind of the background of Blue Planet, which is really interesting because you can tell. If I didn't know any of the mechanics of this game, which I barely do anyway, the setting itself is enough to draw me in, and I can easily see how you can do a lot of really good narrative, character-driven stories in this setting.
There's a GURPS version of Blue Planet, actually. It was licensed out to GURPS, and GURPS wrote a Blue Planet book as well.
Oh, nice.
I forgot about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, the setting, the intention behind the setting was that it allowed you to give real motivation to your characters, real consequences to their actions, and real requirements of what they do to survive and interact with other people.
And real death.
Yeah.
It's a pretty lethal system.
Very lethal system.
Yeah.
Before we jump into the official part of character creation, actually making our people, we usually like to go over some terms that we think people will kind of need to understand in order to follow along. So there were a couple that we kind of made note of. The first one I wanted to talk about is attributes. Does one of you want to talk a little bit about exactly what attributes are in this game?
Sure. They're the classic stats that people are familiar with from just about any older role-playing game. They've got their own terms, things like build and dexterity and awareness, but essentially they are serving sort of that same primary defining feature. Unlike some of other games, these stats are added directly into your skill tests, to your target numbers. So their role is additive with your skills and any tests you have for the attributes themselves. There's two kinds. There's primary, which are ones that you determine through character generation, and then derived, which are sort of created from the primary ones. So, for example, your endurance is going to be based on your fitness and strength, I believe.
It's will, I think.
Will, right. So that you've got some attributes that are determined by other attributes. Unlike a lot of modern systems, there's quite a few of them, relatively speaking. Again, sort of that simulationist approach that was common in the 90s.
But one of the things I find interesting about that, though, is in many cases, if you have someone like a constitution score, or you're making a constitution save, or you're having something to do with that, like endurance in here has to do with your fitness and your willpower. So think about that. That's not usually a common thing that you see in games. And I think that that's really interesting and important in many ways.
Yeah.
So that you can, with strength of will, you can power through things that your body might not look like you could do. And there are a few subtle things that happen in the game mechanics in the system to me that, though, we're talking about simulationism as if it's not, as if it's maybe a challenge for modern gamers. There's this feeling that it feels in many ways real. Like you don't feel like, oh, I'm the smart guy, I can't be the tough guy, right? Or I can't get through this because I didn't buy up my constitution's my dump stat or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
It's kind of, I was thinking about dump stats. It's not a game that you really have dump stats, or that it's really possible to dump a stat. But I mean, you can have low stats and you can have high stats, but because we're trying to create, again, finger quotes, real people, then it's not as easy to get sort of the imbalance associated with the classic D&D barbarian who, doesn't know which end of his sword is pointy.
Right.
Which is, I think true of most real life people is that, you have things that you're good at and things that you're not good at, but very few of us have things that we just absolutely can't for the life of us figure out.
Right. So the attributes, I don't know how specific you want to get about it, but they include build and fitness, agility and dexterity, awareness and intellect, and presence and will. And then the derived attributes drawn from those are endurance, reflexes, strength, and toughness.
Yeah.
Again, like the idea of reflexes as well. So in many games, like your initiative is just based on your raw dexterity. And that always bugs me because how fast you pull a gun out is way less important to initiative than how situationally aware are you of what's happening around you, which has more to do with perception. And
that's why reflexes is a derived attribute. It's
right.
Your dexterity and your
awareness
and your awareness. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's that thing that it's very satisfying to me because it feels like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. Yeah. If you can pull your gun out fast, that's pretty helpful. But also, if you're constantly watching everything that's around you and you're reacting before people are even doing anything, because you can kind of see where things are headed. That's also really important. So it's things that I appreciate about the system.
Sorry, I misspoke. Reflexes is agility, average of your agility and awareness.
Agility and awareness, right? Dexterity is manual dexterity. Agility is body
correct
movement, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, because technically dexterity is a word that references manual dexterity as opposed to full body dexterity. So it's just kind of a thing that's driven into a lot of us if we started playing D&D, that dexterity has to do with your whole body.
Right.
We all learned wrong.
Hey, and also just, hashtag I love D&D. I'm not bashing on D&D. I love it.
Oh, it's fine. We
you know what I'm saying.
It's the gateway drug of role-playing games. It's a great place to start, but you don't have to stay there.
No.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of this character creation series. We'll be back in part 2, picking up right where we left off.
Character Creation Cast is a production of the One Shot Podcast Network and can be found online at www.charactercreationcast.com. Head to the website to get more information on our hosts and guests, or even some of our character sheets. Character Creation Cast can be found on Twitter at CreationCast. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Bolter, and I can be found on Twitter at Lord Neptune. Our other host, Amelia Antrim, can be found on Twitter at Ginger Reckoning. Music for this episode is used with a Creative Commons license or with permission from the podcast they originated from. Further information can be found within the show notes. Our main theme music is Hero Remix by Steve Combs and is used with a Creative Commons license. This podcast is owned by us under Creative Commons. This episode was edited by Ryan Bolter. Further information for the game systems used and today's guests can also be found in the show notes. If you like the systems discussed and wish to purchase them, links to the products can be found in the show notes. Also, check the notes or the website for cool stuff to go with each character, such as dice or mixtapes. Thanks for joining us, and remember, we find that the best part of any role-playing game is character creation. So go out there and create some amazing people. We will see you next time.
Character Creation Cast is hosted by the One Shot Podcast Network. If you enjoyed our show, visit oneshotpodcast.com, where you'll find other great shows like System Mastery.
System Mastery follows Jeff and John as they scour the bargain bins of game stores across the country to bring you up-to-the-decade reviews of failures and secret successes of RPG history.